Hey there. Time to talk about some gender differences. And in this case, what we need to do is start to look at the faces we've created, the female faces that we've kind of focused on, and they might be female, they might not. Doesn't really matter which one they are at this point, just matters that we're moving in some direction. But now we're going to start to choose a direction, a male or female direction. So these are photos of Blazana, who we've been using a lot in this female anatomy. And she's got some pretty clear female distinctions in her face. There are some kind of male-esque attributes, but mostly this is a very clear classic female head. That's in contrast to, say, this one of Sebastian. And let's go into a 3/4 view of that. Okay, we want to look to see what are the differences between these two different types of faces, and we're going to have a whole bunch of faces to kind of look at and kind of analyze. Let me just make sure you can see exactly what we're working on here. Okay, we're going to put it there and then just arrange and match zoom and location. Well, match all. Let's do that. Alright, so these are the guys that we're looking at. We want to be analyzing male characters. Okay, and this one of Julius is going to be really great. Julius is going to have the most distinct male attributes. Attributes that on a female would just never ever fly. But you can see over here that Sebastian's forehead has a little bit of smoothness to it, although he does have a distinct break in the glabella and the frontal eminence. He does have a slope backwards, and he does have kind of a nice underhang for the nose right there as well. So there's some distinct attributes and a little bit of blending, but you know, with Julius, you would never mistake that that's definitely more of a male head. Let's actually bring in some different Blazana. I'm going to bring in ones that are exactly like these guys here, Sebastian and Julius. Okay, there we go. So now instead of the difference in the contrasting and the lighting, this will be a little clearer because we'll get a full-on frontal view or full side view, profile view. Okay, so any idea on what some of these major differences are going to be between male and female? Well, I should preface this by saying that in terms of forensic science, as I understand it, forensic facial reconstruction, the accuracy that people have, or forensic sculptors have, identifying the gender by the skull alone is less, significantly less than if you have a skull and a hip. If you have a skull and a hip, the accuracy gets quite high. If it's just a skull, the accuracy is quite low. So keep in mind that these differences, while on the extreme side, there's, like for example, Julius, that's definitely an extreme male skull that would be fairly direct to identify. But the difference between Julius and Blazana, or Sebastian and Blazana, sorry, is a little bit less, especially when it starts to get in between them, like the face is kind of a blur of them. There is an absolute place where the gender differences in a skull tend to break down. So we're going to be focusing on Julius and Blazana, but keeping Sebastian in the middle. Okay, let's first, looking at Julius, let's first identify all the primary things that we want to be talking about. So what's the important thing with Julius that we want to be aware of? Let's create another layer, and we'll just identify all of these. Make sure my pin's working. Yes. Okay. So the first thing that we want to really focus on is the glabella. You want to have a clear sense of how this glabella is functioning, and then how that's moving into the superciliary arch. Okay, and I'm kind of drawing them all as one entity, although the glabella kind of gets separated right there. Let's use a hard brush. Okay, so that's going to be the superciliary arch. Okay, the glabella. All right, now then the overhang, frontal sphenoidal process, that's going to be important. The temporal line, that's going to be important as well. The width of the nose here is going to be important. Even the width of the nose from nostril to nostril. Notice that we are not really working with that 1 to 1.6. That makes a female nose and mouth ratio more attractive. We can definitely slim them down, and the proportions do work for males, but we can aggravate that and still get kind of a very male result. Okay, the chin. The width of that chin, as well as the width of that horseshoe shape of the mandible. Okay, the angle of the jaw, how far out this is. So essentially the width of the mandible is going to be important, because in a female they're going to be pulling in a little bit. Female's not going to have as strong of a jaw, although it is possible for a female to have one. It's just in general they're not going to. Okay, so you can see the zygomatic bone a little bit more clearly. Definite distinction here, the nasojugal line. I always say jugal, and I never get that right anyways. The infraorbital, in terms of the meaty part, the infraorbital triangle is going to be different. It's not going to be as full. We're going to have to keep in mind some of the plane changes. Okay, we're going to have to keep in mind the bulbousness of that nose, the alar cartilage. And it's going to be significantly larger than it was on the female. Okay, the lateral cartilage. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking at, plus that sagittal crest. The sagittal crest is going to be really important. Make sure you're pausing these videos and making sure you understand what these parts are. Say the name as I say them. Say the name as you draw over it. When I sculpt, I am literally saying the name of the muscle as I sculpt it. It's just, I find it really quite helpful. Okay, let's press F so we can go back to a normal view. There we go. Maybe I can get tile to work again. Yes. Okay, let's take a look at Julius from a front view. Sorry, side view. And same thing. Let's take a look at what we've got. So, glabella, superciliary arch, okay, nasal bone, okay, teeth. Teeth are going to be in the middle of that lower lip. Okay, zygomatic. Temporal line. Frontal eminence, sagittal crest, nuchal line, mastoid process. You want to get to a point where you're identifying all of these elements. So let me make sure I'm being pretty clear and providing you with as much information as I can here. We've been over the anatomy of all these different parts and pieces, but you may have been over how they can be found in the face a little bit. We maybe haven't covered that as well. So let's go bit by bit. Let's try to identify the frontal sphenoidal process and the zygomatic bone. How are we going to identify that? And let me switch over to my brush, and I'm going to turn spacing down, and let's just get rid of shape dynamic. Okay. Yeah, that'll work. Okay, look for this value change. You see, that's one value, and that's another value. Okay, you squint your eyes, you really see a difference. In fact, that's a brilliant idea. Why don't we duplicate this? We're going to desaturate it. So we're not looking at any color information, or we're looking at as little color information as we can. You can always use high pass to affect how much value something's going to have. So you can get rid of all the subtle variations. Look right there, that's a perfect pore map. It's awesome. But what I wanted to do is just get rid of some of the blotchiness. Doesn't look like I can get rid of blotchiness without causing other problems. So I'm going to cancel out of that. But let's see if we can go in and use some kind of artistic tool to simplify things. So you can always use something like paint daubs. Give it a second to load. Let's move it on over to my other screen. And we're going to look at that at something like 25 or 12%. There we go. Brush size. Might be hard since it's so large of an image to get an accurate sense of this. But now you can definitely start to see more value changes a little bit more easily. So let's just hit OK, because I've got the other one. But now you can definitely see a value change, Okay, this is all kind of one value with a blender right there, and there's another, and a transition plane, and all these values help you define the planes. So you want to be looking at it and thinking this, and what this is essentially saying is that the zygomatic is really the front of the face is here, the part that I'm outlining in red. That's that shadow part. We start to turn to the front of the face, and then the rest of this is starting to be kind of, or is still the side. So that's the kind of thing that we want to try to find, and that's going to tell me quite clearly that this is really the border of that zygomatic. We've got the frontal sphenoidal process, we have the overhang here, and you have that temporal line. Okay, that means the zygomatic is going to be curving forward. This is again just a drawing a line, and we know that the zygomatic is going to be pushing in a little bit above that ear hole. And then again, of course, remember, right there with the nose. Frontal sphenoidal process, and then in. Okay, and that's just, I'm looking and trying to identify how much width I should have there. Is there any identifier? For some reason, I feel like there's a pretty clear identifier right here. But I agree, it is a little bit hard. There is a plane change, or there's a color change right there, I think. I see one anyways. Get rid of that. Okay. Alright, so now the angle of the jaw. That's going to be the head of the mandible coming down, tracing inside, and then out. Now we already know that the thickness of the skin is going to mean that that mandible, that jaw, has to be on the inside. We know the thickness of the lips. There's just some good thickness to the lip. Okay, the columella. And then we also know that the opening of the nasal bone matches pretty much right where that nostril is. Nasal bone, glabella. Okay. Alright, so how was I distinguishing with the jaw? Well, I'm looking here. This is the down plane. Let's do a little gray. You can see that that's a good transition point. The shadow is all right in this area that I'm just detailing right now. Okay, and then the neck kind of starts out from here. So you see the plane change is different. Now we're getting a lighter color in this area as opposed to the darker, which is covering up most of this. And then we get a fairly distinct plane change or color change right above that. So I'm just looking for that value change, and then I mark that in white. And you know, you have to guess. You have to take a guess and try to figure out all that. And then let's zoom out. Yeah. I'd say that's a pretty good, clean indicator. Does that match what we drew initially? Pretty much. So I hope that little bit helps. Those are the indicators that I'm looking for. And you can definitely see how his face, the front of his face, that such a strong, huge brow and sloped forehead, definitely of the masculine order. Okay, and then boom, really bumpy, knotty, just knotted head, I'll say it that way. Okay, let's go range tile. Okay, this is in stark contrast. Let's see, can I do both? Well, it's in stark contrast to this one. Okay, and we're using white. All right. It's a little harder to see the glabella, but you still see the change in plane. So glabella, boom, superciliary arch. Nasal bone, and I'm really going halfway between that, where the nose starts and where there's an obvious dip. So just guessing. Okay, keep going back in space. And you see how far, see how sloped that head is. By sloped, I mean, notice that it's a pretty clear, distinct backward curve. That forehead tends to be quite far forward, really far forward. And you don't find a lot of skeletons or skulls with that. It tends to be this, when you buy a skull from the store, it tends to be the more sloped forehead. Alright, now zygomatic. You always want to go right where the corner of that eye is, and that's where the frontal sphenoidal process is going to line up. Right where the nose is, come back in. And yeah, something like that. I'm a little unsure about how long or large that frontosphenoidal process is, but I think I'm okay with that. So sit here and try to draw these things, but really at the end of the day, what is the biggest difference is the transition. That's what's going to be really significant here. So let's take a look at Julius. And let's take a look at Julius. Yeah, this one. Okay, and you can quite clearly see that the plane changes, the breaks. These are what are very strong, very hardcore in him, and then certain parts are really emphasized. So that glabella, big, huge, knotted mess right there. Okay, and a sloped forehead. Come in here and take a look at Blazana. Really smooth, subtle forehead. You could almost mistake that for just one plane. You might miss that plane break in there. Okay, and then notice that even with his nose, that transition from the glabella to the nasal bone is quite subtle and small. The columella, we're getting roundness, okay? Everything has just more of a roundness to it. That jaw, if you were to just squint your eye and start to look at the plane changes, it's just rounder. Same here, cheek is rounder and filled with more fat to just keep that impression. So overall, those are the things that we want to look for. Those are the styles that we want to be aware of. We want to make sure that with the male, we're emphasizing the glabella and the superciliary arch. So this portion of the face is going to be really important. We want to make sure that the chin and the mandible, the jaw, make sure that that is emphasized and strong. We can emphasize the nose if you want, and de-emphasize the cheek. And take some of the fat out of the cheek and just start to show the muscle more. So play that back over and write down those in a bullet point. Those are the elements that we want to be concerned with, and those are the ones that you want on a checklist to make sure you're covering. Hey there. So we've looked at some system of proportions, two different types, full Caucasian, one with a mixed ethnicity. We've looked at the skull. We've taken both of those proportions and we've created faces out of it, and then kind of tried to go back and forth. There's been a couple of things that we really learned. One of them is that this line here for the zygomatic bone, or the frontocephenoidal process, our tendency might be to pull that back, just like our tendency is to tend to emphasize the mouth area. One of the things that I did in the teaching of this, and mine ended up with that mouth just really so much farther forward. A lot of the literature really pushes you in this direction as well. It's kind of odd to see a skeleton or a skull, and let's just take a look at it real quick. I'm going to turn everything off. Where so much of it is pushed back. It's not really something you see in the literature too terribly often. Let's turn everything back on. Okay, there we go. Turn those forensic markers off. Okay, so now what we need to do is turn this into a dude. And yours might have even started looking like a dude from the beginning. I know that has happened to me 1.5 million times. When you're making a guy, a dude, the important element is to emphasize the structure, emphasize certain anatomical parts, and let's just do that. So I'm going to go back and actually focus on just the skull. Okay, so one of the first things I'm going to do, because I'm just not comfortable with it, is I'm going to adjust this nasal opening a little bit. Okay, good enough for now. should really have the planes intact all the time. Turn backface masking on when I create this plane around the nasal bone. And H polish brush might be a good one to use as well. Okay, get that transition into the canines and then out from the canines. Okay, I'm just reestablishing some structure that got lost as I was doing a bunch of different things to it. Alveolar. Let's turn the floor off. Get rid of that gradient in the background. A little smooth to adjust that. Okay. Yeah, that'll be good for me to move from here. So what am I going to emphasize for the male face? What are going to be the important things for me to really emphasize? Well, one of them is obviously the brow. And the brow is going to consist of a couple of different elements. Okay, one of them is going to be the glabella. Okay, the glabella, and then above the glabella, the superciliary arch. That's going to be really important, and they kind of blend with each other. The division, you could say, is the glabella is going to be this pediment. Well, let's go there. The superciliary arch will continue that along these lines. Okay. The other thing that's going to be important to emphasize is the supraorbital margin and this overhang. Everything's just going to get less round. Everything's going to get a bit more bulky. And the bump and the difference between the superciliary arch and then the frontal eminence that's going to become more prominent. Okay, the nose probably going to become wider, so this should get wider from the beginning. The cheek, zygomatic, we're just going to bulk it, and we're also going to look to just create it a little bit more planed, and maybe push it. Well, we'll just leave it a little bit more planed. Okay, other things that get adjusted. Okay, the angle of the jaw is different. That's going to be really important. On a female, we started to round everything. On a male, we could very well create really significant divot there in the back, and that can really emphasize a lot of elements. So those are going to be the primary things. We're also going to widen that chin, point of the chin there, and I'm going to do this just in the skeleton and then use Transpose Master to push everything into it. So we want to start from the skeleton up and just try our hands. Now I should note I'm in perspective mode and I have set my focal angle to 35 so there was less distortion, and that's, you know, that'll be relevant. So clay buildup and our usual setup. 0.05, and then depth and embed probably to 10. Okay, now see how smooth all of this is? Not a lot of interruption in there, and that's one of the key elements that is going to make this female, is that there's not going to be a lot of bumps and valleys in there. We're going to change that, but let's get clear about the angle and the side profile first. Let me make sure I'm I'm really comfortable with the direction I'm going there. I think that this is going to bump out. Then we're going to have to dive in a little bit, and then the forehead can pick up. I'm going to pull the nasal bone down a little bit so I get more of a ledge right there. Mouth should be fine. We might emphasize that mandible, and then, yeah, as we mentioned, that jaw is going to get a lot of strengthening there. Probably going to push that zygomatic or the frontal cephenoidal process forward. So yeah, okay. Let's see if we can do that at a lower subdivision level first. And I'm going to cut a valley between the superciliary arch and the frontal eminence. Okay, something like that. And then let's just make sure this is emphasized. Add a little bit more volume. And further emphasize it by really making a down plane. I'm going to pull that frontal cephenoidal process forward. Pull it, make it a little bit blockier as well. Let's give it that specific arch. I probably should have done that in the female as well. I'm going to make it a little bit shallower down here. Some of that can be with trim dynamic. We made it bulkier, more full frontal, but we're going to just kind of take some of that away. Okay. Make sure the lacrimal and all of that has a nice transition. Frontal process. Widening that glabella and its influence underneath. Alright, so that already starting to look like quite a dominant glabella. Maybe needs to be trimmed slightly. Okay, and I'm just getting that temporal line and the overhang. Now I want that temporal line, but I don't want to cut into the overhang. And make sure I got a strong sagittal crest. On an ape, this sagittal crest comes back and does this sort of thing. Moves along the nuchal line. And us, we're just going to terminate it right there at the back. inflate. Okay, I'm going to just take care of this. See how the glabella has kind of pulled out like that? I want to make it a little bit more of a two-step hit. So I'm going to just pull in a little bit so it doesn't start to crowd out the eye. And yeah, that's a little better. Still not too massive, but it's definitely quite strong. The cheekbone has diminished in size a bit. Nasal opening. Switch down here to the jaw. And I'm just going to increase the width of that horseshoe shape. And pull the jaw outwards. Let's do this at a lower subdivision level. Yeah. Okay, and then we're going to take this corner, make it more massive, but don't forget to, watch your lines. You might want to, with the move brush, turn AccuCurve on. You can find AccuCurve under Curve, AccuCurve. And this gives you a crazy sharp line, just a beautiful line that can really help sell a detail. Okay, pull that down. Make that rhombus wider. Okay, come back up. Let me check that nasal opening. It's quite large. Okay, but really, let's go to that jaw. I want to pull that out. Alright, and see if that's going to be strong enough. Let's do a quick comparison. Let's bring in the other one. Okay. Let's make sure aligned object is on. Alright, here's our changes. Quite dramatic. But significant. And now in the previous one we didn't really adjust the skeleton. We used Transpose Master to just kind of get everything in shape. So the sculpt is kind of iffy. The frontal process got lost. The nasal opening doesn't look very good. We spent a little bit more time adjusting and making our skull for the male more specific. But the general proportional changes are relatively straightforward. There's more emphasis here in the glabella and the superciliary arch. There's a bit of a hit here where this is a very minor hit. I've pulled the zygomatic forward a bit, and then I've also made the width of it a little bit less. We widened the rhombus That's just like it sounds. The ramus of the jaw, which is this section. We've added an angle of the jaw. We didn't add it really, it's just we emphasized it. We made the entire mandible wider. That was really important. We also widened the nose. Alright, so now the next thing would be to see how this has impacted the muscles and see if we can lay the muscles on top of this. But I urge you to make sure that you do this as an experiment. So you don't want to just get in and start adjusting. You want to do the skull first, see if you get the skull right by now adding the muscles and then adjusting the muscles. And then we're going to adjust or sculpt the face. But you don't want to get too far ahead. You want to go through this process. If it doesn't work out, you want to do the process again. You want to leave room for you to do this a couple of times, because this is a very educational process. You go through and you'll learn what's working and what's not working. This is not about you being a good sculptor. This is about you being a scientist and researching what works.